Rousseau emerges as the principal source of knowledge for the 19th century philosophy. Of course, he was from the previous century. It is rare that one man epitomizes such a wide range of attributes: democrat, romantic, educational theorist, botanist, composer, the man who stood for the underdog, and the philosopher. In the 1760s, Rousseau's influence on education, sexuality, politics, and the self were brought into sharp focus in four of his most compelling literary pieces: Social Contract, Émile, Julie, and The Confessions. Let's focus on The Social Contract. It emerges as Rousseau's most compelling and seminal piece of political theory, which explores legitimate political order in the context of classical republicanism. In his treatise, and I quote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," end of quote. Rousseau asserts the inalienable rights of the individual and the sovereign will of the people. According to Rousseau, freedom is natural, basic, and innate. Rousseau's idea of a form of social organization that guarantees social autonomy and still holds sacred the values of society, cohesive community, is a recurrent theme in all of the social contract. Today, as it has been said, 301 years after Rousseau's birth, 20 years after the original Rio Summit, and following decades of multilateral negotiations, Rousseau's principles of social responsibility, civic freedom, and collective sovereignty have come into stark reality. In short, Rousseau's well-worn social contract has unmasked the complexity of reconfiguring the world's problems into a singular, dominant global governance regime. What would Rousseau make of contemporary multilateralist surveillance regime gridlocked in key areas that have direct links with human security? How would he square with a society that seems to be at odds with the nature-society equilibrium that is staunchly advocated for? Will Rousseau be able to lift today's generation out of this collective myopia that focus on individualism as the gateway to a prosperous future? The rise of inequality across the world has revealed new governance challenges and made obvious the shortcomings of the state and the market, two critical institutions, to act as the only regulatory forces. Can the principle of Rousseau's social contract help to square this circle? 300 years after Rousseau's compelling plea for social autonomy, multilateral institutions have not succeeded in mending the broken pieces of a social contract. My paper will present arguments for a parallel reading of Rousseau's principles of social contract and the post-1992 sustainable development world. If indeed sustainable development is considered as a governance model, it would be important to understand what the Rio +20 summit contributed to this model. Finally, it will be crucial for us to examine the perception of asymmetries in today's multilateral regimes and governance. A recurrent theme of my paper points to the fact that both Rousseau's principles and those of Rio are essentially about change, and that both argue for an institutional regime. This regime will uphold change through rules, social justice, and freedom. Institutions such as sovereign states or an international regime such as the United Nations are necessary to chart the course of change. In essence, they determine its contours, oversee and regulate its enforcement. Rousseau juxtaposes the natural versus the unnatural. He concedes that the maintenance of a social contract is contingent on the process under which members of society determine the social order. This social order is not natural, he says. It is created and maintained by humans in society. In acknowledging the role of social order, Rousseau is also alluding to the complex machinery, processes, and sustenance mechanisms that need to coexist along the vision of social order he advocated. In today's more complex world, the arguments for the maintenance regime for sustainable development and a fairer society are even more compelling. So let me make the first point of my argument, making the transition between Rousseau's principles of social contract to a post-1992 sustainable development world does include parallels. What are those? Our contention is that Rousseau's world of the social contract has several parallels with this post-2092 world. First, as already said, both Rousseau and the iconic Earth Summit are part of change process. Second, Rousseau's social contract cannot materialize without a form of association, rules, and an institutional architecture that will devise and uphold the rules of the game. Equally, a sustainable development regime is maintained by an international structure. Hence, its enforcement and management will need robust institutions to monitor progress. Rousseau's essential yardstick for success resides in the way institutions are sought as a means to show social order and cohesion. Rousseau's state of law comes to full representation in an environment of economic institutions. The social contract is born out of this institutional glue. The existence of a state of law represents basically institutions in that it describes the rules that determine the manner in which society deals with each other. Rousseau's social contract is strongly equated with good institutions and can only be sustained if the individuals within the system do not attempt to dislodge it. In Rousseau's view, the state of nature is the natural default action for mankind. Yet the danger is that when the state of nature is in place, resources tend to be wasted in expropriation and rent-seeking activities. Third, Rousseau's narrative of freedom is intricately linked to the notion of sustainable development and the same principles embodied in Agenda 21. Agenda 21, the blueprint for how nation-states can achieve sustainable development, gives voice and agency to all stakeholders to have a seat at the agenda-setting table to influence decisions on sustainable development. Agenda 21 puts development at the center stage and local actors as the front runners in deciding how strategies and actions can be implemented. Also, the principles of sustainable development cannot be understood in the absence of freedom. Here, Amartya Sen's idea of expanding the concept of development to include freedom to basic entitlements is also linked to the tenets of sustainability and the Rousseauian ideal. According to Sen, deprivation is strongly associated with the absence of entitlement to, and I quote, some good rather than the absence of the good itself, end of quote. Sen argues that in a famine context, the default analysis is not an absolute absence of food or poverty, but rather the absence of entitlement to the food that is available. Sen asserts that famine tends not to occur in a country where free press and openness is observed. In short, when victims of famine are able to make visible their plight, governments are compelled to respond. Sen, to a large extent, poses a fundamental question to Rawls and other political theorists such as Rousseau. If justice is reduced to the product of a contract, who will uphold the interests of the non-contractors, foreigners, and future generations? these interests may be overlooked. And is it the role of the media in today's world or the makers of public opinion to take care of this? The Rousseau idea of the general will is in fact a metaphor for social autonomy and is indicative of the sustainability of societies acting collectively to ensure that the future generations do not have to bear the burden and correct the wrongs of the present generations. Hence, the notion of intergenerational equity mirrors some of Rousseau's principles in abiding by, again, general will as a symbol of law, and law that will work for the collective good of citizens. My fourth point, the notion of power incarnated in the role of the state is an important comparator of Rousseau's general, because the general of the general will is the general, meaning in today's world the state, both in terms of the dominant state and the multiplicity of non-state actors in today's complex world. The management of global problems goes beyond the responsibility and purview of unitary state actor. This is very different reality from Rousseau's world, where the state is omnipresent. The implications of managing global issues such as climate change, trade, or transboundary resources are that their impacts are not contained within neat boundaries. They tend to leak and spill over national boundaries. The state may exercise its legitimacy and authority within these national boundaries, but non-state actors, in the form of international regimes, continue to assert their authority and governance models on many of the countries that are facing such global challenges. Consequently, the dominant state, while still largely irreplaceable, has lost its supremacy, as international regimes are needed in expanding the collective territoriality of the state and reducing the transaction costs by acting as providers of information and facilitators of interstate cooperation. With international regimes yielding greater authority in acting as global hegemons in regulating process of global governance, this move has gradually but consistently weakened the role of the state. Rousseau's social contract will need to reflect the proliferation of non-state actors and an increasingly complex world. A fifth parallel between Rousseau and the post-92 sustainable development world can be found in the immediacy of institutions as emblematic structures for change. However, it is worth noting that Amartya Sen offers a counter-argument to Rawls and even Rousseau on the importance of institutions as upholding the rule of law. Rousseau's social contract is intimately linked to an institutional order as the main legislator of rules that predetermines social behavior. The naive assumption is that the right set of institutions will prevail, and little importance is given to human behavior. As Kant puts it, even, and I quote, a race of devils could, if intelligent, produce just institutions and a just society, end of quote. As noted above, the international structure of governance unmasks this position and makes it inconsistent. And I don't have time to go into the details, but I just raised the point. So my second issue to cover in the paper is understanding sustainable development as a governance model and the contribution of Rio Plus 20 to it. When in 2002, activists, policymakers, and stakeholders met in Brazil under the auspices of the United Nations, the intent was to chart a course for sustainable development. This new resolve was reminiscent of commitments that global leaders rehearsed before, pledging to lift people out of poverty and protect the earth. The Rio Plus 20 summit was intended as a celebration of the Earth Summit to reaffirm political commitments. But beyond the celebration of past commitments, Rio Plus 20 was meant to help global leaders take concrete actions to move much closer to green economy. It was clear that 20 years after the iconic Earth Summit, the world had become a more complex place where poverty and inequality remained staple attributes of many developing countries. So what did Rio not do? Well, many pundits describe it as a non-event, a failure in leadership, a vague agreement, and a weak outcome. Someone is giving me reason. Scientists and activists alike had pinned their hopes on a conference that would emphasize the expediency of a world in distress. But it is not the Earth's life system that is immediately under threat. More than 1 billion of people go to bed hungry every night. Yet critics of Rio Plus 20 seem to have forgotten the controversy of '92 Earth Summit, which was perceived by some critics as having failed to set a new direction for life on Earth. When one attempts to fast forward 20 years, one can quickly discern that the remarkable evaluation of the conference received today is very different from what was said then. Whatever the complexion of the evaluation of 2012, it was clear that countries had failed to design their cooperation mechanisms in ways that provide a new momentum for implementation of, say, Agenda 21. The summit simply laid bare the fact that global commitments with strict targets and uniform measurements of progress were politically unrealistic. There lies both the challenge and the paradox. 300 years after the birth of Rousseau and the foundation of social autonomy, can global leaders come up with a blueprint that can regulate the affairs of so many diverse people, economies, ecosystems, and social formations? How can this uniformity in measurement enable and kickstart action on key principles associated with social contract, such as equity, freedom, rule of law, etc.? And is the blueprint that we are aspiring to something close to what we are calling green economy? Or is green economy the forerunner of a new definition of sustainable development? Well, developing in 2012, Rio, global leaders channeled their energies in defining what green economy is and what it is not, and they failed. Hence, the debate was given an ideological and semantic resonance. Developing countries asserted that the green economy is simply a component of sustainable development and should not be used to dictate the pace of international policy governance. For developed countries, greening the economy through clean energy could be a safe pathway to increasing economic growth and creating green jobs. Subsequently, the efforts to adopt a green economy roadmap with environmental targets, goals, and deadlines met with great resistance from developing countries and some developed nations in Rio. In addition, some critics argue that Rio was a failed opportunity in its interpretation of sustainable development goals that have already been referred here. Sustainable development goals were omitted from the General Assembly resolution, which provided the mandate for Rio Plus 20. However, sustainable development goals have now regained a new momentum since Rio. But perhaps more controversial is the subject on finance and technology and the means of implementation. The cleavage between developed and developing countries in this one was even starker. Developing countries argue that leapfrogging environmentally sound technologies will mean structured, supported from industrialized nations. And this was a key plank of the argument of developing countries in '92 and remains a constant and absolute essential point in the negotiations 20 years later and still unresolved. The overriding question is, should countries commit to a new goal or new goals and implementation of new concepts such as green economy if they are unable to secure the pledge of an international support made 20 years ago? It seems that Rio Plus 20 did not succeed in answering many of these questions and failed to chart a course that will support many of Rousseau's ideals on social justice and freedom. Sustainable development was born out of a historical context. The theory was an attempt to resolve the tension between environmental concerns, the ecological consequences of human activities, and economic, social, and political concerns about human development. However, the central tenet of sustainable development resides in the concept of equity and social justice. This is often associated with Rawlsian theory that suggests that there is a bias in resource allocation towards the least advantaged societies. The intergenerational idea that resource management or mismanagement should not further compromise the well-being of future generations remains a very popular definition since the Brundtland Commission. This is more than two decades after the concept became popular, and our understanding of sustainable development is still evolving. Sustainable development continues to suffer from definitional vagueness. Most critics of sustainable development tend to see it as a far too normative and ambiguous concept that does not allow practical solutions to complex development and environmental problems. Hence, to break away from this inherent fuzziness and ambiguity, the term sustainability is invariably used as a substitute. The rise of global economic powers and new engines of growth, such as Brazil, Russia, India, China, which collective GDP is becoming closer to the size of Japan, France, UK, Italy, Germany, the US put together, is telling us that the world is changing very fast. Yet, in spite of their colossal economies and growth trajectories, their roles in acting as models or champions of sustainable development have been overlooked. What is their potential for achieving sustainable development? China is an example of a country that has achieved growth, but has not necessarily linked growth to the principles of environmental preservation. Critics argue that sustainable development needs to be more flexible and dynamic, able to lend itself to ecological and social realities, not to mention political ones as well. Which brings me to my last point, the perceptions of asymmetries in the current multilateral regimes and governance. Principles such as common but differentiated responsibility, subsidiarity, the polluter pays, have become synonymous with an institutional structure that is largely perceived as the main enforcer of global will. As in Rousseau's social contract, the seeds for a transformative development are deeply rooted in the capacity of the perceived institutions to implement it, and that demands a lot of change. However, the asymmetries of the world are anchored mainly on the North-South divide and have become even more diffused and stratified with the wide-ranging inequalities from the technological point of view, science, or even the basic production systems. This was extremely obvious in the presentation that Carlo just did when he said the European should. Then the expectation that the North will provide the key to unlocking development in the South is now a pipe dream. Many of the big northern powers have channeled their energies elsewhere, and questions of how efficient and clean technologies can be transferred have remained rhetorical questions. Other global leaders, such as the European Union, have not succeeded in persuading a disinterested United States to take a strong role in the management of the global commons. Consequently, the paradox is that the role of international regimes, such as the one promoted by the United Nations, in managing the state of equilibrium between the three pillars of sustainable development has become more difficult as the New South focus on environmental degradation as the chief culprit to their growing problems of poverty and privation. The voices of the Group of 77 in China seem to become even more discordant in a world where the coalition politics, regime, and networks are becoming the main bargaining chips. How can Rousseau's social contract be given more relevance in a complex world where present generations are held accountable for future generations? Justice between generations is becoming an increasingly compelling issue given the fate of future generations and growing environmental degradation and economic stagnation. The idea of justice between generations has become acutely felt for all the reasons that we are following in the press. Whatever the strength of this master narrative, the notion of intergenerational equity and solidarity are today even more compelling as a new discourse that must shape our political discourse and global governance regime. The problem is how to do it. It is our obligation to future generations to present a central ethical problem, both in terms of our approach to an aging population in the north and a booming younger population in Africa. Let's consider this conundrum. Africa has the fastest and the most youthful population in the world. Over 40% of the current population is between 15 and 24. In the interest of intergenerational equity, how can we draw up a new social contract that will take this demographic timeline from a self-enlightened interest? Can we cut a deal with the rest of the world, we Africa, given that Africa will be the custodian of the young generation in order to harness the considerable potential that this generation represents? A counter-argument is how prepared are we to deflect the potential tension that can arise from an urban youth population that is rapidly growing, educated, unemployed, frustrated, connected, and lacking political space. Given the relative stagnation of employment in the 15-24 age bracket, how can we design and use a new social contract to ensure that more and more youths that are currently on the margins of development are not written off and become fully absorbed in the economy? Colleagues, the real challenge of the 21st century is our ability to address this demographic conundrum in a manner that will preserve the interests of future generations. How can a new social contract realign the disenfranchised, the old, the young, the poor, back to the center of our development agenda? Today's elderly generation in Europe, in Japan, is able to enjoy a relatively prosperous old age, mainly because their working lives are comparatively more prosperous than those of their parents. To what extent can Europe or Japan sustain its social welfare with the old without renegotiating a new contract with Africa to sustain the generations of the future? The answer to this riddle will lie with our ability to right many of the current asymmetries that the world is currently witnessing. And in my paper, I developed three: the market asymmetry, the institutional asymmetry, but there are many more. But let me just focus on one, the youth asymmetry. The current youth dynamics in Africa presents a new challenge. It is reported by the UN that in less than three generations, 41% of the world's youth will be Africans. It is believed that between 2010 and 2020, Africa will count an additional 163 million people to its potential labor force. In addition, Africa's labor force is set to outgrow China's by the year 2035. Approximately 54% of Africa's youth is currently unemployed, and more than three-quarters live in less than $2 a day. In Africa, the tendency is that youth unemployment tends to increase with higher education levels. Another constant is that government programs aimed at promoting youth employment are totally inefficient. This is the case for at least 21 countries in Africa, according to the ILO. Although literacy rates are on the rise, Africa, compared to the rest of the world, tends to lag behind, which basically means the following conclusion. The real rationale 20 years ago is not radically dissimilar to the Rousseau's ideal of freedom and justice and the need for a participatory form of democracy that becomes the model of choice. A wholesale shift from the Rousseau ideal to a new contract that will take into account intergenerational equity still ensure that institutions are aligned to societal needs and that market opportunities abound will be a hard model to follow in today's complex world without having a new contract with Africa. Thank you.